Hi everyone, how are you doing out there? It's Thursday again. Woo! Weeks are flying by, as I've been saying before, but you're very aware of them when you're standing on camera every week. That it's like the weeks just zip by, which I suppose is a good thing. It means that you're enjoying yourself and that time's going quickly, right? But it is startling every week. First thing I wanted to say to make sure that I got it out there and didn't forget, and a reminder for myself as well, is for the next couple of days and kind of running from today through the weekend, any orders over €50, we're going to put a couple of these little beeswax candles into your order. They're a really nice little size. They're kind of like a deep tea light size, but it's very cool. They're 100% beeswax and they smell really, really good. But they're just this roll of kind of like a little honeycomb put together with a candle bit. But they smell very nice when they're burning as well. I'm really sensitive to smells. Like I have a very hard time with very, very strong smells or perfumes and things like that. So I generally completely avoid scented candles of any sort because it'll just start me sneezing. But these are actually a nice mix between completely scentless candles and one that actually are a very pleasant natural smell. I know people refer to essential oils and things like that as natural smells, which they completely are. But I find when they're even being burnt within a candle, I'll sometimes find that a bit overwhelming as well. So this is a good option for if you're not really great with smells, but would like to be able to tolerate something. So all orders on the website from today on, €50 and over, will have one of those popped into them. So the next thing I want to talk about is the fact that my short row class is now live. So if you have joined in the pre-sale of the short row class, the Masterclass, jump into the teachable classes now, and you'll see the first of the lessons is accessible. What you'll also see is I've actually put everything on a schedule. So basically, you'll get an email whenever the next session is going to be released. And what you can see right now is you'll just see a little locked icon, but you'll see the topics coming up under each week and how many days from then it's going to be released. You might want to check as well in your teachable settings, take a look to make sure that you've allowed me to email you, because if you have opted out of emails, you're not going to get those emails. Now, you don't have to get them, obviously, but if you want a reminder, you're going to need to allow me to send you an email. Otherwise, just jump in every week. I totally get it with emails that I am very careful about what I leave into emails and don't leave in, simply because it's very easy to get overwhelmed. But if you want a reminder, you may want to change that setting, because otherwise you can easily forget. What I kind of had popped up here before I went in and I was thinking about, because we've been thinking about it a lot all this week and I've had a few questions about it, was cast-ons and how you decide cast-ons and what's the difference between them and things like that. So if you had any specific questions about cast-ons as I'm talking through, just pop them up here, or if something comes to your head. Or if you have difficulty figuring out what kind of a cast-on you should use, just put the question up. I'm not going to go through every different type of cast-on. I will call out the names and give you an idea for where it could be used, or alternatives if you don't really like that particular cast-on. And I will tell you that for most people, they will just have one favorite cast-on. Generally speaking, it's usually the long tail cast-on. That's what I see most often than not. If you don't see a specific cast-on called out within a pattern and it's a fairly standard pattern, then feel free to use your favorite method. Long tail is good because of the fact that it forms an attractive edge. It's not too loose, it's not too tight. It's a good catch-all one. On my website, or if you're an English style knitter, Irish style knitter, who holds your yarn in your right hand, then you'll probably discover that the thumb method of that, which I've got underneath long tail cast on, I'll have the standard one where you hold the two yarns like this and you dip in and out. Thumb method, where you hold one yarn here and the other yarn over here. So what you're doing is you loop it with your thumb, you knit a stitch with your right hand and then you lift the loop over. If you normally hold your yarn in your right hand, that's a really useful one. Got a couple of questions popping up here as well. Elsa Louise, what's the best cast on for socks top down? Yep, I'll get to that. Your favorite cast on is the cable cast on. That comes in as the second after the long tail one. I find is that the cable cast on is another really good a standard one. It's a little slower to work than the long tail cast on, and I use it in certain situations because I find the cable cast on, it's a nice edge because it does look like a little bit of a cable, but it can be a little bit, it's not as stretchy as the long tail in my experience. So that's one reason why I will use it if I've got something like, let me just grab this here. If you've got a sweater, this is just this is Kalia sweater, but it's top down and the sleeves are removed. And across the underarm here, you've got two lots of stitches that are live on the needle and you need to join them. In a lot of top-down patterns, they'll call out the backwards loop cast on. I don't like to use that, and the reason I don't like to use it is because it's very stretchy and it tends to splay open. The reason it's used is that you can put them straight onto the needle you're working and join up the next. So it's a very fuss-free way of doing it, but I usually like to do the cable cast on. But in order to do that, you have to turn your work to the wrong side, do the cable cast on, and then when you turn it back, you've got your stitches on your right needle and then you can continue on. But if you think about what a cast on looks like, as in that case, it's good and firm, that's exactly what you want for the underarm area. So the kind of cast on you want has to reflect what you want the work to do. So if you've got, I've got a few questions here. There's a good few you can do the cable cast on loose enough. Yeah, that's fantastic. That would be my second after the long tail cast on. The cable cast on would be my preferred. And anytime it's being exposed on the edge, the cable cast on actually looks very nice. So the edges of work where you're doing bottom up, or particularly something like socks from the cuff down, it's really important that you've got a lot of stretch, especially for the sock, because it has to go over the entire heel, which requires it to, I'm taking a look, probably stretch to at least twice the width. So you need a super, super stretchy cast on. The standard one that I've seen that works pretty well is, that's called out, is the Jenny Stretchy cast on. And with that one, it's a fairly awkward one to get the hang of. And what you're actually doing is more or less putting kind of extra loops in as you're working it. One reason it is nice though is it gives a huge amount of stretch. Downside is when it's not being worn, it's going to have kind of a little bit of a wrinkly edging to it. I do find that the long tail cast on works for me for that, but what I do when I'm working it a little differently is I'll do an individual stitch. Then I will, rather than pulling it tightly, I'm very careful to not pull too tightly so that there's just a small bit more give between them. And that's usually enough to give me a good bit of stretch. That works very well if you've got stockinette stitch. If you have ribbing, one of my favorite methods is the Italian cast on. It's fantastic for ribbing. And it's one of the first times I started using it was for brioche, because of course brioche basically looks like a 1x1 ribbing. So something that looks like brioche is going to work well. Let me find it here. Here, these ones were the mitts that I had done for the Seasons Club. They're not in brioche, but again, because you're trying to stretch the mitts all the way on here, like across the widest part of your hand and down to here, you wanted a lovely stretchy cast on. But because this cast on was going into a 1x1 twisted rib, it was an ideal spot to be able to do the Italian cast on. It looks, to me, the Italian cast on is as attractive as a tubular cast on, but it's easier to work because it's all done in one row. So it's one where, how can I describe it? You just hold it in your hands and there's just a looping back and forth. Again, it's on the website Stolen Stitches, but anytime you want to do a 1x1 cast on that has got lots and lots of stretch, such as with brioche or for a ribbing, a 1x1 ribbing for a top down for a cuff, or in this case for the edge of this. It works very, very well. So that is well worth trying. It can take a little bit to get used to it because the Italian cast on has a tendency of twisting a little bit as you're going between them. Another good one, not so much for this, but that has got a kind of an attractive edge and has still got a little bit of bounce, would be the German cast on. German twisted cast on is very good. And some other specialty ones that, of course, you may have come across that you're just going to use in very particular situations would be the provisional cast on, either the crochet provisional cast on or the invisible cast on. Both of those would be my preferred method of doing it. Like the crochet cast on is and if you're newer to it and if there's not too many stitches, is fantastic because it's very easy to undo when you come back and you can see exactly where it is. There's a couple of issues though, as in if you've done a crochet cast on and it's going from knit to purl stitches as you're working up, what ends up happening is it'll twist back and forth, and so it doesn't unzip very easily. In those cases, or if you've got a load of stitches, I would recommend the invisible cast on. And with that one, you're using the waste yarn, or you can use a second needle instead of waste yarn and actually put it straight on the needle. And you're going back and forth. And then when you're just going to then knit off of that waste yarn. And sorry, I'm not wording that quite correctly. You're doing the waste yarn and you're wrapping the stitch at the same time. So when you start knitting the other direction, the waste yarn is just holding the other side of the stitches, so you don't have to unpick anything, it's just all sitting there. And once you get the rhythm of it, it's very, very fast, so it's great for a lot of stitches. So if you need a provisional cast on that you want to do quickly and you're going to do over a lot of stitches, the invisible one is the one for you. Elsa Louise, possible masterclass on cast on and bind off techniques. Ooh, that would be interesting. And one of the things that's actually very, very interesting for me is because like most people, when I'm just starting off knitting a new project, I'm generally going to go for my tried and trusted ones, unless there's a very specific reason otherwise, such as I want the ribbon to flow from the cast on, I want it very stretchy, or I need to have a provisional cast on of some sort. Other than that, I will generally tend to go to my tried and trusted. So it is very, very useful to have good video backups for me or for you, where you know where to go to and you know which ones will fit into different particular areas. So for instance, if you're like, okay, I need a stretchy cast on, which one am I going to go for? It's like, let's see, will the Italian cast on do it for me? So by actually having tested several out and seeing what they look like, even if you don't remember in your head how to work them, you know which one you need to go look for when it's time to use that technique for a particular situation. One thing I haven't actually mentioned that I do use relatively frequently as well is if you've got a 1x1 edging and you want like a standard amount of stretch but not necessarily too much, then the alternating cable cast on works really well. And that's one where you do the standard cable cast on for the knit stitch, where you go into the front and you knit it. But then for the purl, when you come from the back, you wrap that way and you pull it back. And it actually works very well because it gives you, again, a nice smooth transition from your cast on into your knitting. That's one of the things that you never think about with the long tail cast on is, as you're working it, you're wrapping the yarn to create the cast on, but you're actually knitting the first stitch. So it's creating the first row of knitting, and it can sometimes, depending on how you're working, create like a bump on the front of it or a very obvious first row of knitting. So some of the other ones that are a little bit stretchier are in fact more likely to be just the cast on without the knitting row on the top. So that's why some of them are firmer than others, depending on the style of cast on. But I would suggest kind of just jumping in and taking a look at different cast on types before you start your project, just in case there's another one that's more suitable. And it's a fun thing to learn how to do new cast ons, because it's one of the things that I do find that you're very likely to just jump in with the standard one, particularly at the start of a project when you're really eager to get going, you just want to get in the needles. You don't necessarily want to slow down and start thinking about the cast on. You just want to get it started, right? That's me anyway. You know what? I just thought of a couple of different cast-ons that I hadn't really mentioned. And these ones would be if you're starting from it's very center point outwards, so like the middle of a shawl or a blanket or something like that that was center out. And there's a few ones that you can use for that. The first one would be, there's a pinwheel method where you're kind of creating a loop and knitting the stitches off that, and then you tighten it in afterwards. I've only used that a couple of times, but for a project I'm working on, I actually want to go jump back in and do a refresher, and we'll probably put up a video on that. And the other method I've done is a very straightforward one where you just knit tiny little standard I-cord for 3-4 stitches, just a small one with waste yarn, and then start knitting off the other one. And then when you come back, you can unpick the waste yarn stitches and then just draw your tail through the 3 or 4 stitches that you had and tighten it up in the middle. So it's I quite like that one. You're just using the I-cord as a holding mechanism for holding those stitches until you want to take the yarn out and pop those live stitches on so that you can tighten them up afterwards. But that's for one if you're just starting in the middle. So they're kind of a good overview of different types of cast-ons and different places you may or may not want to use them in. And it does make a very big difference, because if you've got one that is either too stretched out for the project, or if it's too tight, it can kind of really cause a problem with the edge of the work. I know there was a question back here. I'm just going to flip that. You're asking, what do I recommend for toe up socks cuffed cast off? It's the opposite, it's frilly. Okay, so for the cast off or for the bind off, for those going up, I will sometimes just use a standard cast off or bind off, but just kind of leave a stretch out. Jenny's cast off is quite nice, where you do a stitch and then you do a yarn over that you pull over. The other one that I've used is an elastic bind off, where you knit 2 stitches and then you knit the 2 of them together through the back loops. You knit the next one and you knit 2 together through the back loops. So that one gives just a little bit more stretch as well. But I will find that for the frilly edges, when it's being worn, it does. Let me just grab one here. This one, you can see this was done using the Jenny's amazingly stretchy cast off or bind off. And when it's left unworn, it does have a slight frill. When it's being worn, it lies pretty straight because it's stretched out a little bit like this. But you can just use a standard one with a good stretch between. The key is all in kind of making sure that you're aware of the tension of your yarn and you're not pulling as tightly as possible. Because I have seen situations in bind offs where garment is perfect, particularly top down, and then the sleeves were finished and the bind off was so tight that as you were putting your hand in, it actually felt like you were going to rip the edge. So if you can see that happening, be aware of it. And with bind off as well, there's other situations where you do want it tight. So if you've got a buttonhole edge like down the front like this, you don't want it splayed out, and it's going to get quite a bit of stretch. So for those ones, you actually want a fairly firm one where it's going to hold its shape. Even more so for the edge of a neck, where it'll flare out if it's too tight. Or if you're worried about if you've got one where you're pulling on like this and has to go over the head, you in that case need to make sure that there's enough stretch in it so that it's able to go over your head. So you need to think about where it's going to be, how it's going to be worn, how you'll get the item on and off, and if it's going to perform its most basic function and allow the garment to be worn and look well and not detract from it. Whether it's too loose or too tight or just not looking exactly right. But yeah, put a little bit of thought into your cast-ons as you're going through, and I would challenge you all this week to go and see if you can try a new cast-on to you. Just pick a cast-on, pull your needles out and give it a shot and try out a new one. Whether it's the German twisted you've never done, or maybe the Italian cast-on that I've just been talking about, or the invisible cast on for a provisional method, and give it a shot, see what you think. And if you learn something new, I'm going to check up on you all next week and see if you've tried something new out. You'll try a few new things in your second sock. Excellent. It is worth trying a few times, and as you're going through, if you're not happy with what's coming out, just give it another shot and see if you can get a better result. That it's all trial and error, that what works in one situation won't necessarily work in another. So give a few different techniques a try to make sure that you're happy with what you come out at the end of the day. Well, bye everyone, and I'll be back next week. If there's anything you want me to chat about next Thursday, let me know here, and I'll talk to you then. Bye.